Thanks everyone for coming. I especially want to say thank you to all of the organizers of this conference. It looks like a great couple of days, and there's a very illustrious group of people in this room, including very some speakers in this room, and I just wanted to say that it's really an honor to be here. I'm very grateful for the invitation. There's a handout that's gone around, probably not quite enough for everyone, but probably enough for everyone to share, at least have a look at one somewhere in their vicinity. Has everybody got one, or can everyone see one? Not everyone can steal one from someone else. Can everyone in cyberspace see the handout? So one occasion on which I actually wish I had done a PowerPoint presentation. All right, so as some of you know, a lot of the work that I've done over the past while falls under the heading of what people are variously calling the metaphysics of science or scientific metaphysics. And part of this work has been about connections, possible connections between science, philosophy of science, and metaphysics. Now, I'm not going to talk about those more general and what I take to be very important issues today, at least not directly. What I'm hoping to do here is to exemplify some of the morals of that discussion in a sort of case study of the metaphysics of science, and thereby give you a glimpse into at least one of those morals, one of the morals of these larger thoughts today. And these larger thoughts are, as in Stathis' case, part of a book that I'm working on. I'm hoping to finish with that in the next little while. And so part of what I'm going to do today is to draw on elements of that and draw on elements of some previous work that I've done, some of which I know some of you know about. The central question of this paper is posed at the intersection of two great debates in metaphysics and the philosophy of science. The first of these debates is about causation, whether it is, in fact, part of the fabric of the world, as opposed to merely being a concept without a referent. The second debate is about subatomic ontology, whether we have warrant for belief in the system of particles described by modern physics, as opposed to agnosticism or some more severely skeptical attitude. Regarding causation, I'm going to proceed here at a certain level of abstraction. So by causation, I'm going to intend any view that's realist as opposed to deflationary. And I'm just going to assume a highly generic realism about causation for the sake of argument. So for the purposes of today, it's not going to matter whether you think of causation as a sui generis relationship between certain objects or events, or as a special sort of process in which objects transmit certain quantities along spatio-temporal trajectories and sometimes transfer them to others, or whether as a form of counterfactual dependence between objects or the states of objects or events involving them, or as manifestations of dispositions. Right? All of these, what I'm going to call traditional views of causation, have at least one thing in common. They all describe or analyze causation in terms of relations of, or properties of, or relations between the states or properties of objects and events involving them. So on traditional views, objects and events are the locus of what, for lack of a better term, I'm just going to call the oomph of causation, the causal modality. Now, regarding subatomic ontology, I have something more specific in mind. My interest here is in so-called structuralist approaches to understanding the nature of the world at the level of particles. And so the central question of this paper really comes down to the following: is structuralism compatible with causation? So let me specify one last bit of terminology here just before I dig in. The terms object and event are helpfully vague, right? So I'm just going to proceed here with the thought that the term object is a label for the reference of both count nouns as well as mass nouns. So quantity of liquid is going to count here as an object just in the way that as an atom would. Both are putatively causally efficacious. The term event is also a term of art. There's some dispute, for example, about whether it applies only to changes in objects or whether it can also be applied to include temporal durations during which objects don't actually change as such. I'm not actually going to care here much about that sort of detail. So broadly conceived, let me refer to objects and events as entities. That's the term I'm going to use. Now, entities are central to traditional accounts of causation as the repositories of causal modality. And as we'll see, it's precisely their role here that raises questions about the compatibility of causation with structuralist accounts of subatomic ontology. Okay, so that's all really about terminology. Let me say something about a couple of assumptions. I mean, even if you suppose that some sort of generic commitment to the reality of causation is okay, you might nonetheless wonder whether it's appropriate to think about causation in the context of physics. After all, there are a lot of people who think that causation is sort of alien to modern physics, especially in fundamental physics, where it might be very tempting to think that theories are just basically collections of mathematical equations. We should interpret them as describing really nothing over and above the temporal evolutions of certain systems, and certainly nothing that you might call causation. And then there's the time reversal invariance of these descriptions in contrast to the putative asymmetry of causation, and the challenge of interpreting correlations between distant measurement events in cases of quantum entanglement, blah, blah, blah. Okay? I'm not actually going to engage with these debates here. Instead, let me just begin with the assumption that causation is something that can and should have a place in our best scientific conceptions of the world, including those derived from physics, including fundamental physics. And one powerful motivation for that assumption, at least for the purposes of today, comes straight from philosophers who advocate structuralist views of fundamental particles. Throughout the development of these views over the past couple of decades, the idea has been that the relevant structures should be causal. Sometimes they're described as modal. That's been a pretty steady refrain. So here's one example. After just describing the sorts of structures that he's interested in as those comprising certain webs of relations, I think I've given you this quotation on the handout, Stephen Branch is quick to add that this web of relations is inherently causal. The quantum structure that we are concerned with can be considered to be causally empowered. So the structuralist approach to fundamental physics is supposed to be compatible with the idea of causation, at least according to many structuralists. What I want to do today is to think a little bit about whether and how that can be so. Now, prima facie, worries about the compatibility of causation and structuralism stem from an apparent conflict between the traditional picture's association of causal oomph with entities and the downgrading of the ontological status of entities on structuralist views of subatomic particles. So I want to use this quest for causal compatibilism really as a kind of tool here, as a kind of case study for thinking about the relationship between metaphysics and scientific realism more broadly. So I'll begin by looking at the details of the particular case, and then at the end I'm going to extrapolate out wantonly and irresponsibly. Okay, so let me get going here just by setting the table for structuralism. I suspect that many of the people in this room are very familiar with this, so I'm going to be brief. There are lots of areas of the sciences where scientific taxonomy is a fruitful subject for philosophy, focusing on the more precise metaphysical natures of the members of the relevant categories. So here I have in mind theorizing about the precise ontological category or categories to which an entity belongs, where ontological category doesn't refer here to the name of a scientific category like protein or giraffe, but rather to the finer-grained ontological types or characters of the members of these sorts of categories. Fundamental physics is a great example, right? Having determined the state-independent properties, mass, charge, spin, in terms of which particles are classified, one might reasonably want answers to some finer-grained questions concerning the more precise ontological status of the things that ostensibly have these properties. The fact that the precise ontological natures of the particles described in the standard model are very difficult to understand merely amplifies that pressure, right? So in some contexts, including measurement, they appear to behave in some ways like familiar entities with well-defined properties. In other contexts, also including measurement, they don't. So there's significant controversy here over the question of whether particles can be individuated or distinguished from one another on the basis of their properties or their relations or otherwise. So given all of these things, what's a realist supposed to say? Well, in some past work, I've argued that one approach to this question, and that's the approach of suspending belief in particles, pending some further developments in the physics, is not really the way to go. Right? So, given that that's the case, I suppose first, why might we think that? Well, I think it's going to be entirely self-undermining for the realist to take that kind of approach. And that's because particles seem to satisfy all of the criteria that are typically held to indicate the viability of realism elsewhere. So on a realist interpretation of the data, the relevant entities are detectable. We've measured the values of their properties with great accuracy and precision. They can be causally manipulated in intricate ways. They can be used to interfere with other entities. Theorizing about them has generated novel predictions, which have been confirmed in lots of experiments. So on pain of renouncing the epistemic warrant that's supposed to be conferred by those kinds of indicators, I think we find ourselves undermining realism very broadly. And so the case for realism here, I think, is in a way inescapable. And yet, the metaphysical disorientation remains. And the doubt it sows, I think, is understandably real. So what I'm going to do next is just codify the gazillions of attempts that have emerged to cope with some of this disorientation by means of some form of structuralism. And for each form, what I'm going to do is attempt to locate the possible ontological home of causal modality. And after that, I'm going to show how each of these approaches inevitably leads us to further disorientation in locating the causal modality where it does. And I'm going to try to draw some morals from this. As many of you know, the past decade and a half has seen a kind of surge of interest in structuralist accounts of scientific knowledge generally, but most intensively in connection with fundamental physics. More specifically, as a generic thesis about the ontology of subatomic particles, we can understand structuralism as an attempt to reorient what I'm going to call the standard metaphysical picture of the relative ontological status of entities and their relations. So on the standard picture, physical entities have what we might call a non-derivative ontological status vis-a-vis their physical relations. By physical relations here, I mean non-logical or non-mathematical relations. Their existence is independent of any such physical relation. Conversely, physical relations have a kind of derivative status. Their existence depends on some things of which they are relations. So to illustrate this with just an everyday example, an arrangement of chairs around a table, a given set of concrete spatial relations between these entities, depends on the existence of the entities themselves. Without some such entities, there could be no arrangement of tables and chairs at all, let alone any particular arrangement. Any given arrangement or structure is derivative of the entities. And in contrast, as any decent home decorating show or my wife will tell you, any particular set of items of furniture can exist in any number of arrangements and can survive the creation or destruction of any specific arrangement. So the structuralist proposal aims to reverse the traditional direction of ontological dependence between relations and relata at the level of quanta. As an example of this alternative picture in its intended domain, consider the structure of the Poincare. So we can identify quantities that are invariant under the associated symmetry group transformations with properties of particles like mass, charge, and spin. But on a structuralist interpretation, the relevant properties and concomitantly the entities that have them depend on the group structure itself for their very existence. They may depend on other structures as well. That's one way to get into the plot. The structure of the group, in a way to be specified, provides some sort of ontological grounding for the properties of the particles. In this way, the structuralist view turns the standard picture of ontological dependence on its head. Now, rather than try to unpack and examine every form of structuralism individually, my approach here is going to be conceptual. There are just far too many now to talk about in any one given talk. I think it's possible to codify the conceptual landscape of structuralism by noting that all of these positions ultimately fall into one of two camps, which I'm going to refer to as eliminative structuralism and non-eliminative structuralism. The non-eliminative camp has two variants. One that takes the existence of entities to be derivative of their relations, but not vice versa. So this asserts a kind of ontological priority of relations over relata. And the other variant takes the existence of entities and their relations to be sort of mutually derivative. So this asserts a kind of ontological parity of relations and relata. So let's consider each of these conceptual camps in turn, and in each case, consider what ontological resources they provide for a possible explication of causation. Now, eliminative structuralism, to be perfectly accurate here, I think it's important how we talk about this, it doesn't really reverse the direction of ontological dependence between physical relations and relata. It doesn't reverse the direction that's suggested by the standard metaphysical picture so much as simply rule out the direction that's suggested by the standard metaphysical picture. That is, it does suggest a dependence of relata on relations, but it isn't an ontological dependence per se, because on the eliminativist view, there simply are no relata. Right? So eliminativism reverses the direction of dependence only in a sense. Right? It replaces the idea of ontological dependence with the idea of sort of conceptual dependence. In other words, it says that our notions of particles are entirely acceptable concepts. Right? The use of these concepts is absolutely fine. It's only misleading if you take them to have physical counterparts in the world of the sort described by the standard metaphysical picture. So the eliminativist structuralist adopts a non-literal construal of particle talk so far as ontology is concerned. So if eliminativism involves the non-literal use of terms like electron and neutrino, then what are these terms elliptical for? Well, a clue here comes from one of the original motivations for the view in discussions of permutation invariance. So quantum theory assigns no physical significance to certain permutations of particles, which is reflected in the ways that the states of affairs involving them are enumerated using quantum statistics. Permutations don't count as distinct physical arrangements. Eliminative structuralism really takes this idea of no physical significance and extends it to the particles themselves. So any description of causation here, whose referent isn't merely a concept, but also some actual physical modality in the world, is going to have to locate that modality in a system of relations that lacks physical relata. All right, so I'm going to return to that in just a moment. Turning to the idea of non-eliminative structuralism, we might again inquire into the location or the source of causal modality. And one possibility is to do exactly what the eliminativist does, right? I think that strategy is actually available to the non-eliminativist as well. Additionally, though, the non-eliminativist has a further option, because unlike eliminativism, non-eliminativist versions of structuralism propose ontologies of particles literally construed. And this just opens the door to the possibility that entities might play a role in causation, after all, just as traditional views of causation suggest. The idea that entities could play causal roles here has to be understood, though, in a very specific kind of way. Recall that non-eliminativism, while allowing that entities are genuinely part of the furniture of the world, nonetheless see them as derivative of or dependent on their relations. And that's typically cashed out by saying that the very natures of these particles, what it is that makes them what they are, is relational. To put it another way, that's to say that the identity of a particle is determined by something extrinsic, something else, such as the property of occupying a particular place in a system of relations, as opposed to any intrinsic property or properties. Now, this is ambiguous, I think, right? Is it the individual identity or the kind identity of a particle that's determined that way? In other words, is it the identity of an electron or a neutrino qua individual entity that's determined by the relevant structure? Or is it the identity of an electron or a neutrino qua member of a category of particle that's determined relationally? And insofar as we're hoping to find a home for causation here, I submit that the answer to this question really has to be the latter. Right? And that the issue of individuality here is really kind of immaterial. I think a lot of these debates have gotten hung up on the idea of individuality, and I'm not sure it's germane to a lot of what actually is being claimed. Only the kind identity of an entity is relevant to questions regarding its causal efficacy. It's only in virtue of having the properties that are attributed to a kind, like a category of entity described by subatomic physics, associated with a specific mass, charge, and spin, that particles have causal potentialities, have a causal profile, and thus play a role in causation. So with that last clarification, I think I'm ready now to try to evaluate these different options that I've just put on the table. So having canvassed the possibilities for thinking about the locus of causation on both the eliminative view and the non-eliminative view of structuralism, let's consider now whether either of these options is tenable. And what I want to do is to suggest that each of them generates an obvious metaphysical challenge, actually challenges. Some of these have been discussed in various ways in the literature. But these discussions, I think, have been inconclusive. And what I want to suggest is that there's actually a very good reason for inconclusiveness here, and this is going to tell, I think, on the theme of the conference. What I want to suggest is that this inconclusiveness naturally arises from the fact that arguments for causal compatibilism in this context inevitably exemplify a certain pattern of reasoning that terminates in a dilemma. And neither horn of the dilemma can be forced on merely on the basis of physical or metaphysical considerations. So the result is a kind of principal disagreement regarding how best to describe the ontology of these underlying arguments. So as a prelude to elaborating that idea, let me first just outline in very general terms the pattern of reasoning and the dilemma that I have in mind. So this is on your handout. So let's assume that compatibility with the idea that there's causation in the world involving particles is a requirement or a constraint on any acceptable form of structuralism. Then, regarding any particular version of the view, the pattern of reasoning that I have in mind goes as follows. So first, you start with a given version of structuralism, and on that view, you determine the possible locus of causal modality. Then, in evaluating the tenability of that proposal, you find yourself faced with a metaphysical puzzle, or a challenge. And in order to resolve that puzzle, to dissolve it, what you need to do is posit an ontological primitive, one that is contentious. And then you're faced with the dilemma, right? Accepting the contentious ontological posit or rejecting this version of structuralism. So at the end of the pattern of reasoning, we're faced with a kind of choice. And solutions to the challenges that versions of structuralism invite are by no means obvious, I think. And as a result, the choices to be made are actually far from clear, or at least that's what I'm going to suggest. So to go with the first part of the dilemma is really to orient your thinking in a way that might seem kind of prima facie contentious. Some might argue fatally undermining. But it's to orient your thinking in such a way that what might seem that way to others is actually accepted as reasonable, all things considered. To go with the second point of the dilemma is to view the metaphysical commitment involved in the contentious posit as a kind of reductio of the form of structuralism issue. Now I'm going to suggest that this kind of choice applies to both eliminative and non-eliminative structuralism, and should thus inform our understanding of structuralism, period. And this is where I will extrapolate wantonly, I think, applicable to thinking about questions in the metaphysics of science much more generally. Okay, so the upshot is going to be that when it comes to causal compatibilism, there are two kinds of people. There are people who are unperturbed in the face of metaphysical disorientation, and there are those who are repelled. So let's begin with eliminative structuralism. Recall that for these guys, causal modality has to be located in a system of relations lacking the sorts of entities, the relata, that are traditionally held to play a central role in causal phenomena. Again, in the words of French, here's a quotation: the quantum structure that we're concerned with does not exist independently of any exemplifying concrete system. It is the concrete system, and as such, it can be considered to be causally empowered. But then a puzzle arises immediately, right? And various people have discussed this in the literature. How can a system of relations be concrete in the absence of the sorts of entities whose being related is what is standardly thought to constitute the concreteness of a system of relations in the first place? Right? Standardly, relations in the absence of relata are regarded as abstract, not concrete. They're physically realized and thereby causally efficacious only when they take entities as their relata. So by concrete and abstract here, all I intend is the ordinary distinction between things that have spatio-temporal locations, whether they're highly determinate locations is a separate issue, and are thus capable of acting or being affected, that is, participating in causation. And things that aren't capable of acting or being affected because they have no locations. So on this everyday understanding of concrete and abstractness, concreteness is a prerequisite for causal efficaciousness. The question facing eliminative structuralists then is the question of whether a relation can have a spatio-temporal location without itself being a relation of anything in particular. And the standard answer to this question, of course, on the standard picture is no. Relations in themselves are abstract. They're multiply realizable sorts of things. They're concretized when they have entities that they relate. Conversely, the answer that the eliminativist has to give is yes. And it's immediately clear, I think, that the way they generate this positive answer, the only way they can, is by reifying the relevant relations. So let me call them relations in themselves. That's to distinguish them from the relations of entities. Now, in making that move, the eliminativist is proposing a new ontological category, one that wasn't previously countenanced on the standard metaphysical picture. And furthermore, this new ontological category has to be taken as a primitive. That's because on the standard picture, the state of affairs in which relations in the absence of relata are concrete is kind of inexplicable. And eliminativism doesn't appear to give us any further explanatory resources in terms of which to elaborate the claim that such a state of affairs is possible, let alone how exactly. So every way you slice it, the metaphysical status of this new ontological category of spatio-temporally located relations in themselves is that of a primitive. Now here, I think, we come to the crux of the pattern of reasoning that I outlined earlier. Right? In locating causal modality, eliminative structuralism invites the challenge of understanding how relations all by themselves can be causally efficacious. And in order to dissolve that challenge, it adopts a new primitive, spatio-temporal relations in themselves. Now commonly, when a primitive notion is invoked to say a hypothesis, responses vary, often quite reasonably. Right? So one response is simply to accept that there's something here about which nothing further can be said. Right? Fair enough. On the other hand, you might regard this as a failing to provide insight into something about which we might reasonably expect to have some significant understanding. So the choice between these options splits the world into two kinds of people. Embracing the new primitive saves causal compatibilism, but those who can't bring themselves to accept relations in themselves must then reject eliminativism for failing the test of making causal compatibilism intelligible. And since the cost-benefit analysis of adopting or rejecting a new primitive here may vary between what I would think of as otherwise rational agents, the decision doesn't appear to be forced on metaphysical grounds alone. And given that eliminativism is just one interpretation of the mathematical formalism of the physics of particles, the choice doesn't appear to be forced on scientific grounds either. Okay, let me turn to non-eliminative structuralism. Recall that the non-eliminativist is at liberty to do what the eliminativist does and associate causation entirely with what we call relations themselves. I think that's a possible option for them. We've seen what that means. But what's distinctive about non-eliminativism is that it has this further option, in virtue of its not merely conceptual commitment to entities. It has the option of analyzing causation in a way that appears, prima facie, to fit seamlessly with traditional accounts of causation, which connect the oomph of causation in various ways to entities and their properties. So the important qualification here is that, in contrast to the standard metaphysical picture, according to which physical relations are ontologically dependent on their relation, the non-eliminativist takes entities and their properties to be dependent on their relations. Their kind identities are relational. They're constituted by an extrinsic system of relations. But then, a possible worry arises immediately. Can the identity of a particle depend solely on the relations in which it stands? Well, typically on the standard metaphysical picture, intrinsic properties of entities play a role, an important role, in constituting identities. And you might wonder whether a purely extrinsic characterization is sufficient to make these identities intelligible. In fact, I think the distinction between the intrinsic and the extrinsic here generates a kind of interesting puzzle for relational identity as follows. A lot has been said about the contrast between intrinsic and extrinsic properties, but I'm just going to proceed here with the understanding according to which an intrinsic property is one that's possessed by an entity independently of its relations to other things. So they are, to use an awkward and kind of metaphorical expression, contained within the entity in question. And that's why, on the standard picture, they often play a role in thinking about identity. On the other hand, an extrinsic property is one that's possessed in virtue of an entity's relation or relations to some other thing or things. But then, on a purely extrinsic description, how do we apprehend the entity that stands in these relations? The ontology of non-eliminativism an entity can only be understood in terms of extrinsic features, that is, in terms of relations. And one might worry that this generates a kind of circularity or regress. In order to understand what an entity is, you have to appeal to something extrinsic. But then you might reasonably wonder what it is that stands in these relations. And the only answer available must again be given in terms of something extrinsic. So to put it another way, you might wonder what the it is that's related to something else, in virtue of which one is able to speak about extrinsic features in the first place. To answer that question by citing yet further extrinsic features just takes us in a circle. So it appears that non-eliminative structuralism is susceptible to a puzzle concerning the idea of extrinsic identity. In order to describe an entity extrinsically, we seem to require a conception of something with prior reference to which something else might count as external. But that's precisely what's lacking on the non-eliminativist. Given that extrinsic properties don't by themselves yield an understanding of what entities are above and beyond relations in themselves, that's a worry that eliminativists can ignore, but that non-eliminativists who want to associate causal modality with entity really can't ignore, then we're faced here with a metaphysical challenge. Now, in reply, if the non-eliminativist wants to treat entities as a locus of causation, she must, I think, go ahead and posit the existence of entities whose kind natures are exhausted by purely extrinsic properties. So let me call them internally extrinsic entities, right? Again, just to coin a term, to distinguish them from entities that have some qualitative intrinsic properties. And by qualitative here, I just mean to rule out primitive principles of identity, like exceedance or primitiveness. So in making this move, she's proposing a new ontological category, one that departs significantly from the categories of the standard metaphysical picture. And since nothing can be said about the natures of these entities that doesn't invite a kind of goose chase of circularity or regress, they have to be taken as primitive. That is to say, the category is inexplicable in the standard picture, and non-eliminativism doesn't provide any further resources in terms of which to elaborate the posit that these things are ontologically tenable. So once again, we see exemplified here the pattern of reasoning that I outlined earlier. Right? So the initial promise of non-eliminativism in associating causal modality with entities and their properties, just as traditional views do, gives way to a kind of puzzle concerning what these entities are exactly. And in order to dissolve the challenge that's inherent in this puzzle, we have to adopt a new primitive, internally extrinsic entities. Just as in the case of eliminative structuralism, a primitive notion is invoked to save the hypothesis of causal compatibilism. Now, one response to this maneuver is just to accept that there's really nothing more that can be said about these entities, and that's something that you can do. Another one is to balk at the invocation of entities whose natures, one might contend, should really be amenable to some better understanding. So once again, the choice splits the world into two kinds of people. Accepting the posit of internally extrinsic entities may allow for causal compatibilism, but if you can't bring yourself to accept the new primitive, and if you're likewise suspicious of relations in themselves, then you really have to reject non-eliminative structuralism. So again, it seems that otherwise rational agents may assess the virtues and vices of adopting the posit in different ways, thus ruling out a definitive metaphysical demonstration of the superiority of one option over the other. And again, given that non-eliminativism is just one among other interpretations of the relevant physics, the science itself, I think, is likewise inconclusive. All right, so I began this talk with the aim of examining the hypothesis that structuralist accounts of the ontology of subatomic particles are compatible with the idea that causation is a genuine feature of the world at this level of description. The resulting tour of the conceptual spaces in which different forms of structuralism might realize that hope terminates, in each case, in a dilemma, the form of which will be familiar to anyone who's ever taken an interest in analytic metaphysics. At the end of the day, it seems that a given hypothesis, in this case, causal compatibilism, is defensible, but only ultimately by way of primitive notions whose acceptability can't really be demonstrated beyond an illustration of the sorts of metaphysical work that the relevant posit might do. Now, at this point, it seems that different choices regarding trade-offs between accepting or not accepting arguably contentious primitives and rescuing or not rescuing the hypothesis at issue are possible. Now, certainly, it doesn't seem to involve any kind of logical error to go one way or the other. In that sense, my description of the terms of this dilemma as a dilemma, right? That might seem overly dramatic to you, right? Because if there's nothing ultimately damning qua inference in the choice to grasp one horn of the dilemma as opposed to the other horn of the dilemma, then the horns themselves may not seem especially pointy. But I think the dilemma is serious in at least a couple of ways. The first way is obvious, and that is that ideally, given the aim of causal compatibilism, you might hope reasonably to achieve that aim without having to appeal to contentious metaphysical posits. You might love to appeal to posits or assumptions that everyone would be happy to accept. Neither horn of the dilemma allows for that. The second way in which the dilemma is serious has, I think, a much broader significance, and it's this larger issue that I want to now consider in the few minutes that I have left. So as I hinted earlier, debates about the different forms of contemporary structuralism can be viewed, I think, as case studies in a much larger debate about the tenability of scientific realism, specifically regarding the relation of this kind of realism, scientific realism, to metaphysical theorizing. It concerns the question of whether resolving all of the metaphysical details, for example, deciding which of the two horns of the dilemma I presented is the right one to grasp, is a requirement for scientific realism. In other words, you might wonder just how much metaphysics a scientific realist has to do, if any, to defend the plausibility of realism. Now, earlier I mentioned in passing that the sorts of criteria that are generally cited in arguments for the sorts of beliefs typically associated with scientific realism are amply satisfied by subatomic particles. So if a commitment to the reality of particles and their properties all by itself qualifies as metaphysical, in the way that a logical empiricist might think it does, then clearly at least some metaphysics is implicit in defending realism. But that much metaphysics, if the label is in fact appropriate there, is clearly acceptable to any scientific realist. The metaphysical theorizing at issue here is a deeper sort of kind, right? It's the kind that's involved in responding to questions that go well beyond committing to the reality of scientific entities and their properties, to questions about, for example, the kinds of ontological categories that they inhabit. So many people, I think, feel that if we take definitive answers to these latter questions as a constraint on the tenability of scientific realism, that we're really asking for a lot. Perhaps we're asking for too much. So, in just the last few minutes here, let me just sketch another possible way to go, and some of this is going to resonate with things that Stathis was saying earlier. This other way to go, I think, allows realism a way out of the sorts of dilemmas that I've explored here. I think of it as a kind of third way. And I don't think it's the only way, but I think in this context it's a third way. So scientific realism is often thought to imply the view that our best scientific theories describe well, that is with some significant success, the ontology of the world. That view is taken to follow, I think, from the primary description of realism as the position that our best theories are true or approximately true, describing things that actually exist, even if they can't be detected by the unaided senses. Now, it's arguable here that there's a temptation to carry this implication too far. So consider the following. To take us out of the realm of physics for a moment. Molecular cell biology describes processes in which chemical reactions, certain chemical reactions are catalyzed by enzymes. Now, presented with the evidence for these happenings, a certain kind of realist might well commit to the reality of enzymes and reactions and processes in which enzymes catalyze reactions. The further and more deeply metaphysical questions concerning what a process is exactly, and what distinguishes causal processes like these from other possible kinds of processes, go well beyond the sorts of questions that can be answered definitively, even from a realist perspective, on the basis of the scientific evidence for the reality of enzymes and chemical reactions. A knowledge of the scientific entities is, in a sense, detachable from answers to the deeper questions. That isn't to suggest that the deeper questions aren't important, but I think they're interestingly detachable. So in just the same way, I suggest a knowledge of the ultimate nature of particles is in a sense detachable from the knowledge that they exist, and with that, some significant knowledge of what they're like and what they do. So this suggests a third way to proceed in the face of dilemmas of the sort that I've articulated here. Right? Scientific realism is compatible with the idea that it may be very difficult and perhaps even impossible for us. And whether that's something that's just impossible for us now, or whether it's something that will continue to be impossible for us so far as we can see in the future, on the basis of the kinds of evidence we have, to argue definitively for the one true account of the fine-grained ontology of the world. This suggests that realism about certain kinds of things should be compatible with a more pragmatic attitude towards the answers you might give to at least some questions concerning their fine-grained ontological status. The case of structuralism, I think, is a really great example of this point. So here you might say, let's take a pragmatic attitude towards the finest-grained metaphysical proposals in coming to grips with the idea of causal efficacy. Different versions of structuralism can be interpreted as furnishing a plurality of fine-grained ontologies, all of which are, ex hypothesi, compatible with scientific realism. You might have good evidence to support realism concerning an aspect of the world while simultaneously lacking sufficiently telling evidence regarding its finer-grained ontological profile. And I think this opens up the door to the possibility of realist pragmatism in at least two dimensions. So theorizing about finer-grained ontology fills in our conceptual pictures of the ontology of science in different ways, which then has the potential to lead to deeper understandings, or at least potential understandings, of our commitments pending further scientific investigation. So the pragmatic commitment here is really to something like the potential heuristic utility of attempts to understand the natures of things beyond the reach of our current science. In part, as a primer for scientific conceptions of things to come. Right? So this is where what I'm saying kind of resonates with what Stathis was saying towards the end of his talk. And I think the history of natural philosophy and even the modern sciences have illustrated on a number of occasions that sometimes metaphysics is proto-science. Right? So Stathis was talking about Carnap. Popper talks about this as well. That idea, I think, was in the air, and a number of people talked about metaphysics in precisely those terms. But there's also a pragmatic virtue in the application of different conceptual pictures to different contexts of scientific work in the present. Right? So I don't mean to put this down as all sort of hope for the future. Different accounts of fine-grained ontology may well best suit different explananda now. There's no obvious reason simply to assume, for example, that all of the subject matters of fundamental physics, let alone the natural sciences more generally, should be described correctly in terms of any one account of fine-grained ontology. I mean, there are different kinds of things, right? And the natures of those things may turn out to be rather different, in which case it would be a mistake, I think, to try to analyze them all in the same way. There's no obvious reason, just to take an example, simply to assume that if there are such things as space-time points, they should have precisely the same ontology as subatomic particles. So the investigation into how structuralist views of particles might be conceived in such a way as to accommodate the notion of causal modality in the world is really a kind of microcosm for a much larger issue. The project of elaborating these views inevitably runs into metaphysical challenges that divide the world into two kinds of people. Those who are willing to adopt arguably surprising ontological primitives, and those who take such maneuverings as signs of degenerating research programs. With a dose of pragmatism about descriptions at these very fine-grained levels of ontology, the realist can both preserve her scientific commitments and also make something of very deep metaphysical theorizing. So here, what I really want to do is oppose the view that many anti-realists have taken, and actually that some realists have taken, to the effect that we should dismiss versions of scientific realism on the grounds that it's all a bunch of metaphysics, and that unless we can resolve all of the ambiguities concerning the natures of, the fundamental natures of unobservable scientific entities, right, at every conceivable level of metaphysical depth, right, Until and unless we can do that, then we have no good reason to believe in the entities at all. This possibility of realist pragmatism also has the virtue, I think, of being something that most realists already accept. I think it's something that most realists who haven't ever worried about the relationship between science and philosophy of science and metaphysics already accept something like this, if only unconsciously. And that's because of a much broader phenomenon, which I won't talk about here, but which is part of what informed my thinking about this in the book. As we delve deeper and deeper into the fundaments of ontology, we find that most people, at any rate, not everyone, but most people have a breaking point. They have a breaking point beyond which they simply find the questions being asked and the answers being given too far removed from the empirical evidence to be evaluable, or perhaps even worth considering at all. And I associate that breaking point, the location of which I admit and actually expect may vary from one person to the next, as the point at which we cross over from realism into pragmatism. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Anjan. I think, yeah, you're absolutely right to press on the issues that you press on. However, I think that I don't agree with how you characterize, in particular, the eliminative structuralist conception. And I think a clarification of that actually points the way towards the solution, or at least some response to some of the objections that you made regarding kinetic properties and how kind properties seemingly could be, were subject to some kind of infinite regress and how we understand them, something like that, right? So first of all, so when you say that eliminative structuralism adopts a non-literal construal of entity talk and an ontology of relations without relata, I think at least for a certain set of structures that's not right. Okay, so some of the paradigmatic structures that structural realists talk about are things like the entanglement relations that exist between particles, or the spatial temporal relations that exist between points in a space-time manifold. And it's just seems to be obvious in those cases, right, that you can't have these relations without relata. That's what those relations do. They relate things, space-time points and quantum particles, not respectively, very, very opposite. So I don't think the structuralists, right, they don't, even eliminative structuralists don't deny that those objects are there to be related. What the claim is that they're nevertheless not fundamental, right? They're sort of built out of the objects in some way. So given the relations, you get the objects for free or something like that. Now, in my own talk, I'm actually going to just mention how it is very hard to kind of maintain that kind of relation of ontological priority when you have these necessarily coexisting sort of entities. But that's the claim that they're making, right? The claim is there aren't objects only when we're speaking in terms of like ontologies, right? With a language that only ranges over what's fundamental. But it's not right to say that they don't think there are relations without relata, okay? However, there are a class of structures it seems the structuralists take seriously that it seems can be understood in some sense as being structures that don't relate different objects. So the obvious example here are symmetry structures. Right? So, for example, you might think, so these are very, very important class of structures in structuralism. And so you could think of, say, right, there is like there's a Poincare structure in a world, in a Minkowski spacetime with just one free particle in it, right? Or there is some kind of, there's some other kind of global symmetry structure in a world that has nothing but itself interacting like one sort of scalar field, something like that. Okay, so there it seems that we can identify a structure, but it's in no way obvious that this structure can be analysed as, or usefully thought of, at least in the first instance, as relations between different things. Because in those cases, I basically gave you one thing, right? The free particle of the field. Now, what's important is it's actually in those cases, right, that it's through those symmetry structures that don't obviously seem to be relations between different objects, that do exactly the work that we've talked about of defining kinds. Okay, so it's you work through the representation theory of the respect to the Poincare group or whatever our symmetry group was for a single self-interacting scalar field, and then out pop the kinds. So it's really not clear, right, that it's given that we understand kinds in terms of those structures, which don't seem to be structures that relate different objects. It's not clear that there is some kind of infinite regress. And even, I should say, even if it did seem like there was some kind of infinite regress, more would need to be said by way of saying that that means that the whole concept is illegitimate, right? Otherwise, you could rule out the kind of principle of sufficient reasoning style argumentation that's, sort of, for example, very, very popular in culture. Okay, but the main point is the second one, right? That it's not clear that when you understand the sort of structures that are relevant to thinking about kinds, that they are usefully thought of as relations between things in such a way that we generate them.
Okay, great, thanks a lot. So I take it you're making sort of two big points, so let me just address them in order. The first has to do with the interpretation of eliminative structures. Now, you'll note that I was careful to say that I was going to proceed conceptually. That is to say, I didn't, although I did use French as an example of an eliminativist. What I haven't done here is classify all of the slightly varied positions that appear in the Stanford Encyclopedia article on structural realism into either one of these camps. And that's because I think there's a non-trivial exercise involved here in trying to figure out what it is that they're saying. Now, to the extent that you're right, if it turns out that the non-eliminativists aren't really eliminativists in the sense that I've described, then I may be describing an empty category, right? I'm trying to cover the conceptual space, right? So I think there would be the problem that I described, or the interesting challenge and the dilemma that I described for that part of the conceptual space. Now, you may argue that it's empty. I actually don't think that it's empty. So I think that even if you want to say that there is something there, it's really, really, really thin, right? It's so thin as to think that you might want to call yourself an eliminativist. If you think that there's something there, then I don't think you're an eliminativist anymore. And the eliminativist people that I talk to, some of them started off as eliminativists and now they're not eliminativists. But at least some of the eliminativist people seem to want to hold to that. So what they say is, yeah, I don't mean that there aren't things like electrons, there aren't things like neutrinos, but those things have to be reconceptualized. Okay? So there aren't those things as described by the standard metaphysical picture. And that's what I mean when I say that they're eliminativists. They're eliminating that kind of entity from their description, their ontological description of what exists. And I think there are such people. But then you and I could argue about whether there are any people that fall into that category or not. I don't think it's telling for the argument I gave, but I think it's an interesting question. The second question, I fully take that on board. I think that's absolutely right. So there are various structures that we're not going to want to talk about necessarily in terms of relations between relata necessarily. Nevertheless, I think the kind of metaphysical picture I described for the non-eliminativist is going to apply in just the same sort of way. It has to do with, I think, a very deep metaphysical question about how we understand the nature of something that might be understood structurally. So even if the structure isn't something that we're thinking about in terms of the kinds of relations you say aren't applicable. And I think this goes back, has a long history in 20th century philosophy, but even beforehand, of people who have denied or find it very difficult to get their heads around the idea that we can understand the nature of something in terms of what I call something extrinsic. So this applies not just to the case of understanding non-eliminative structuralism, it applies to my own view, which I like a lot, the dispositional essentialist view of properties. People say, well, you know, what is it to be a property? And I say, well, it's to be disposed to enter into all kinds of relations, or for that matter, we understand its nature in terms of various kinds of structures. And then they say, oh, but then, and then they trot out the problem that I have. And this is a debate that rages in analytic metaphysics. Some people think that they can't get their heads around that. And ultimately, I say, look, there's no circularity here, there's no regress here, because ultimately there's a primitive. I take a property to be a disposition for, a power for, a potential for relations, which we can understand by characterizing them structurally. That's a characterization of it. But the existence of the thing doesn't depend upon the relevant structures obtaining. I'm not even sure what that means in this context. Right? I know it means for relations to obtain. I'm not sure what it means for the group structure to obtain. That's the worry, right? Is that it's difficult to get your head around that. Now, if you don't think that there's a problem with that, then that's fine. You fall on one side of the dilemma. You say, yeah, that makes sense to me. But there are lots of people for whom that doesn't make sense. That's all I was trying to point out.
Okay, sure. So just to say that I'm not saying that everything is by any means clear with respect to this sort of structuralism, understanding of an object, right, in which sort of notions of group representation theory are really central to it. But it's not the problem. If there is a problem, it's not the problem that you identified in terms of this potential sort of circularity, and also it's just begging the question against the structuralists to say that you've got an object, there's a structure, and therefore we're identifying this, the nature of this in terms of something extrinsic to it. It's different from it. It just begs the question.
Of course it's begging the question. That's my point, right? I mean, at the end of these disputes, when you elaborate all of the metaphysical underpinnings of these views, ultimately the only way you're going to be able to argue against the other view is by begging the question, by refusing to accept something that they ultimately take as primitive and that you take to be problematic. And there are lots of ways of taking it to be problematic. You might think it's not sufficiently simple in the metaphysical system you described. You might think it doesn't cohere as well with other beliefs you have. There are all of the sorts of theoretical virtues that you bring to bear in assessing whether a particular metaphysical theory, or for that matter scientific theory, is the right one to adopt. And that's why I describe it as a kind of principled disagreement. Right? I think you're right.
Okay, Jessica.
Yeah, what did
Keep going. Go ahead, Jessica.
Okay. I was going to do for non-linear structuralism, maybe something that Harry is trying to do for linear structuralism, because I guess I just didn't really see that there was a dilemma here. On a way that I would like to understand non-limited structuralism, which seems like a, kind of an attractive view, appropriately, humble and so on. That gets at, there's some stuff, and then, the relations and the relata come together, right? There's not necessarily a priority here. And, but the idea is that the relata are functionally characterized. So what you call the odd positive and internally extrinsic entity, I would think that the non-limited structuralist would just say, it's just a functionally specified or functionally characterized entity. And those functions include causal relations. So there's no conflict here whatsoever between non-limited structuralism and
Yeah, so again, I agree. I think that's what they would say.
Yeah.
Right? So the person on the other side is someone who, just to give you an analogy, like G.E. Moore, when he was arguing against idealism, said, look, I just can't get my head around the idea of an internal relation. That is, I can't get my head around the idea that something, that the nature of something can be characterized, that its existence, its identity is characterized fully in terms of these functions. There has to be something in virtue of which these functions are functions. That's the kind of puzzlement that I'm trying to express. Now, I actually have your intuition, at least when it comes to space-time points, at least. I think these are super, super thin things. And so I think that some characterization like this might be the best way to go.
But I'm confused because, why would the scientists and the, people who are interested in understanding science care about like this inaccessible intrinsic characterization? They can allow that. Yes, there's maybe God could know the intrinsic nature of the relata, but that doesn't matter. I think it's in fact compatible with structuralism, non-limited structuralism, to say that the relata have an intrinsic character, which we may or may not be getting onto. But if where you've got access to are the causal and functional relations, I just am not seeing the problem.
Well, I mean, so here again, I mean, all I can do is refer you to people who think that this is problematic, right? So, given the line that I'm taking, ultimately, right, I want to kind of distance myself to the kinds of worries that these people might have. But there's a recent paper by Dorado and Morganti, right? In which they say, look, this is extraordinarily puzzling, and ultimately the only way we can make sense of this is to go with some kind of primitive conception of the identity of these objects.
What exactly is the problem that they're identifying? They're saying like, because again, the non-limited structuralist does not have to say that there are entities whose nature is fully extrinsically characterized. What they're saying is that the access to which we have these entities is just purely extrinsic, functional, causal, etc. They can grant that there might be some kind of intrinsic nature, but we just don't have, and it's not necessary for scientific purposes. So is the concern at odds with what I just said? Is the concern that there could be no objects that do not have an intrinsic?
I think so, because I think they're saying more than that, right? They're not saying that, oh, these things might have a rich internal life, and we're just talking about some extrinsic features of them. They're saying that what it is that makes them what they are the extrinsic features. So
why
that
would
could,
the non-limited structuralists be required to say that, given the epistemological motivations for structuralism?
I don't know, that's just what a bunch of them say, right? So, again, I'm not trying to defend the position, particular positions that I found here.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to do is describe what I take to be a kind of general problematic that occurs in the context of doing the metaphysics of science, which is that you ultimately get to a position where reasonable people can disagree with respect to which way they want to go.
Yeah, but that just sounds like a bad, somebody's doing bad metaphysics.
Well, I mean, when you're on one side of this, the other side is going to look like bad metaphysics. Yeah.
Okay, Jean.
Yeah, I'm sorry, maybe, I don't know if I should ask a question, because as a physicist I'm a bit lost in this discussion. I maybe don't understand exactly what the issues are. But let me say, you see, it seems to me that the greatest metaphysical innovation of the 20th century is the claim, the official claim by physicists, that actually there is nothing out there, and there are no laws of nature. Particles don't have properties. I mean, they have mass and spin, meaning have integer spin or something like that, but they don't have a given value of the spin before you measure it. They don't have any property before you measure them, and the measurement may create reality in some sense, so we don't know what's going on. It seems to me that that's a major metaphysical innovation. I mean, I think it's also, I also think it's wrong, but you know, I mean, that's, I will discuss that this afternoon. But the point is that this is really the great, and I don't know if what you're talking about is trying to get around this problem or dealing with this problem, since you haven't mentioned it. You know, whether all this question about, you talk about particles and so on, and you say reconceptualize the particles, etc. Well, how should I think about electrons? If the electrons are not localized, they don't have velocity, they don't have spin, they don't have any particular property, is that what you are dealing with or something else? That's the first question. The second question is about underdetermination. It seems to me that you are taking a sort of conciliation, marriage, as you say, between realism and pragmatism, and that's facing the problem of underdetermination. But it seems to me that if there is genuine underdetermination, in the sense that you have simply equally simple theories and with equal predictive value, okay, then my attitude as a realist is simply to say that we don't know which one is true. I mean, there's no choice to be made on pragmatic ground, because, you know.
Right. All right, so with respect to the first issue, yeah, I think the kinds of views that you're describing are also on the table. So they weren't the ones that I was talking about, right? But I think that if you do take if you do have an understanding of these properties such that, you know, they're created upon measurement or that sort of thing, then you will then have a whole other story to tell about what the natures of these properties are. And that whole other story might well be another story that admits of the same kind of analysis that I give. There are going to be puzzling features of this story. Ultimately, we may not be able to convince the person who adopts such a story that they're holding a view that's incorrect, apart from ultimately begging the question against them. So I think that the kind of larger problematic that I'm talking about here would embrace that view as well, although I didn't talk about it in particular here. With respect to underdetermination, yeah, I think underdetermination is a kind of master argument that appears in the philosophy of science in all kinds of places. And it's doing some work here too. So what sort of work is it doing? Well, what I was describing was the idea that realism at certain levels of description might be in some sense detachable from realism at other levels of description. And I think the assessment of where it is precisely that you take underdetermination to be such a worrying problem that you then pass over from realism into pragmatism, or realism into something else, agnosticism, or something like that, is, I think that's a really interesting question. And my own thought is that there's no one answer to that question. right? It depends on a kind of agent-relative assessment of how much, of how good, how strong the inferences are. And I think that we as a group of philosophers often have very different assessments of how good these inferences can be. And that's why you have very hardcore analytic metaphysicians who think that they are not only arguing about facts, but they're arguing about facts that they can determine. And then you have empiricists, on the other hand, who think that a lot of this stuff, even if we take it not to be nonsensical, it's just stuff that isn't really truth valuable for us. And then you have lots of people in between. And what I'm trying to suggest is that realism fits in that spectrum, right? There are a lot of different ways that realists might characterize their own beliefs. They might accept more or less metaphysics depending on how threatening they take the problem of underdetermination to be in these different domains.
So my concern was, I guess, similar to what Harry and Justin was saying, but I wanted to kind of get clear on how exactly you see a dilemma rising. I'm not sympathetic to any form of structuralism, so it's just, but I don't necessarily see what the structuralist is doing is problematic in these ways, and I want to kind of understand better how you think it's problematic. So you say, like, just take the eliminative structuralist. So eliminative structuralist, let's just say maybe under a fundamental description, doesn't have relata, has relations, no relata there. And then you say, so he's forced to reconceptualize relations and postulate this kind of new metaphysical category or something like that. And that's going to be a kind of problem. But I mean, one thing, this was kind of passing things that Jess was saying, maybe explicit, is I just think that's a really, that just seems to be a strange way to characterize what the structuralist is doing, because I take it what they're doing is they're saying, well, this kind of metaphysics, that's what I want to replace. So what you had, and maybe it's reconceptualization for those of us who are kind of assuming these kinds of, categories of substance with intrinsic properties. But that's not what I'm doing. I'm not giving you more stuff. If anything, I'm stripping away from the category of relations that this requirement that there be these substances with these intrinsic properties, because when we do science and construct our theories, we just don't require these things. So I maybe not necessarily, well, I don't know, the structuralists, when I read like Russell or, that's what it seems like is going on. Not a postulation of a new kind of metaphysics, but kind of stripping ontology or our understanding of science away from these earlier superfluous metaphysical categories.
Yeah, I don't think that's what's going on. So it's one thing to say, here's a metaphysical picture. We'll just strip some elements away from it, right, and do with less. I mean, this goes back to my question to Stathis about whether the Humean picture is just getting rid of a bunch of metaphysics and leaving us with less, right? That is somehow not constituting itself a metaphysical proposal. I think by stripping things down, we're actually proposing something that's at odds with the original metaphysical picture. That was supposed to be the idea, right? So on the standard metaphysical picture, there's a way of understanding the identity of the thing, its character. The thing is intelligible to us via some understanding of something over and above its extrinsic property. And that seems to be what is obviated or judged as mistaken by the non-eliminative structuralists. And I think that constitutes a substantive metaphysical position that's at odds with what I call the standard metaphysical view. So what I'm calling a dilemma is really, I mean, again, I'm not sure whether this is the right way to characterize it. What I'm suggesting is that there are different ways of assessing whether these pictures are intelligible. And different people go different ways. Now you might say that, oh, well, people who go a different way from me are just doing bad metaphysics. But insofar as the picture that they give is internally consistent and coherent, then I don't see how you give that argument except in a question like that.
I feel like maybe I feel like we're talking past each other a little bit because maybe we have different, when we say metaphysics, we meaning different things. So I'm not disagreeing that there isn't a metaphysics there and that there's another metaphysics there if you just mean like an account of what there is and what it's like and what it does. But what I meant, but it looked like the thing that you were calling problematic was taking a traditional conception, that was your word, you said a traditional conception and replacing it with something else. And so if traditional meant something, you know, a priori conceptual structures that we had, that were, or something like that, moving to something that was more scientifically informed, then I agree there's metaphysics in both stages, but there might be some...
Yeah, so here there may be a substantive disagreement, I think, because it depends on what we mean by one of these pictures being better scientifically informed. Now, there's no doubt that the people who've adopted the various views that I'm describing here take themselves to be responding to contemporary physics. I think there's no doubt that, I mean, etymologically you could describe the development of their views as responsive to what they see as challenges in interpreting contemporary physics. So in that sense, it's responsive. In another sense, I really don't think it's responsive at all, in that I think that there is a lot of loose talk in the metaphysics of science. People saying, what I'm doing is I'm reading off the best metaphysical proposal from the physics, or I'm looking at the physics and thinking about you know, how that suggests to us a particular metaphysical picture. And that talk I take to be naive, because for precisely the reasons that I suggested, which is that you can recover lots of different, I'm not saying anything goes, but you can recover lots of different metaphysical positions, depending on what precisely you're willing to allow as primitive notions, how you're going to weight various criteria of theory choice that go into selecting one of these pictures over another. Right? So in that sense, it's all a priori, right? I mean, we want it to be, we want it to fit with our best science, but the point is lots of things can fit with our best science.
Great.
Thank you. This is very interesting. I want to be clear about what your conception of the nature of metaphysical theorizing is. So let's suppose that we're all realists about elementary particles and chemical processes and enzymes and things like that. And as you point out, there's a lot of various metaphysical theories that are compatible with that. Now, if I choose, is it a matter, and you use phrases like knowledge of the deeper nature of particles, something like that. Now, is there a matter of fact out there about what metaphysical categories these particles fit into that people are debating about and undecided about? I mean, that's one way of reading it. Another way of reading it is a more Carnapian way, is that these are just choices of different ways to talk about the same actual kind of, the actual facts. And a lot of your talk seemed to suggest the former, but when you're characterizing the criteria of the debate, things like cost-benefit analysis, those were considerations I can see being very germane to choices about how to talk about things, but whose relevance to knowledge of matters of fact would be obscure at best.
Right. So I think that's a great question. There's something very awkward here in me talking about the depth of the question at issue. I mean, I'm not even, that itself is a metaphor. I'm not trying to catch that out right there. In some places we talk about it in terms of a distance metaphor, right? Some things are really close to scientific inquiry, by which we really mean empirical inquiry, not scientific, since some science is very theoretical. And then some of these philosophical debates take place at different distances from, you know, the empirical inquiry. These are kinds of metaphors, but what I want to suggest is that, I mean, I'm very much open to the former of the views that you've described, which is that I think that the claims that are being made, we can think of them as being claims about the factual, the nature of the world. Right? It's not that these different proposals are just different ways of talking about the same facts. I think they represent different facts. Right? But I think that's compatible with the idea of cost-benefit analysis, because ultimately, I think it's cost-benefit analysis all the way up and all the way down. Right? When the realist is having a debate with the constructive empiricist, the constructive empiricist has a different view of the cost-benefit analysis of believing that subatomic entities are part of the fabric of the world. But they assess the cost-benefit analysis differently, such that they say, no, I'm going to be agnostic there. Right? So I don't think we can escape the idea of cost-benefit analysis and think that it only applies at a certain level of metaphysical theorizing. I think our entire epistemic enterprise is shot through with cost-benefit analyses of these sorts.
Okay, I think we'll draw this to a close. But just before, Carl, is there anything to be said about lunch? Are people on? Oh wait, if you're going to make your announcement, let me thank Anjan, and then you can have the floor. So.